Welcome to Indian Podcasting Revolution, and I'm your host Rohit Kokane. In our newest series, PodPeeps, we pull back the curtains and step behind the microphone with some of the nation's most successful, innovative, and influential self-starter podcasters. From sharing their unique podcast journeys to unearthing their creative processes, PodPeeps is not just about the podcasting. It's about the people, the brave and visionary individuals who dare to use their voice and change the game. Today, we have with us Aishwarya Ashok, a product manager building stuff from ground up. She is the host of the Founders Foyer podcast, which is full of hallway conversations, the space where early stage founders, builders, and creators look for the foundational concepts and support to grow their ideas into products. I'm sure you won't miss out on this episode where she will share all about her podcasting journey. So, are you ready? Let's tune into the voices of change, the voices of India. Welcome to PodPeeps on the Indian Podcasting Revolution. Hi Aishwarya, welcome on Indian Podcasting Revolution. It is such a pleasure to host you.
Hey Rohit, thank you so much for the invite, and I'm so glad to be here to talk about the stuff that I love doing.
Absolutely, and it has been a great conversation with respect to the kind of episodes that I hosted, and you being one of the person who I have always wanted to interact, and I'm getting this particular chance, and we are going to have a great conversation out here. And when we talk about the podcasting and you being a kind of a product manager, used to build things from scratch, what initially drove you to the world of podcasting? Because it always thrives on the organic conversations and the shared experiences that we have. So, how did this idea translate into the concept of founding Foyer?
All right. That's like a very weighted question. And I think part of it is something exactly like you said, right? What drives you through to sharing experiences or getting into conversations with people. So I think that was the largest push for me to enter into the podcasting space, because I think when I started out, it was mostly like, oh, like let's just get going with people, let's just start talking to them. But now in the recent times when I was just thinking about, okay, why did I enter into podcasting? Like, what do I do by running a podcast? I realized that most often people start a podcast not with the intent to actually start, or rather, the success to doing good podcasting is never about always starting with, hey, I want to start a podcast and then going and then figuring out things. Rather, it's a lot of thoughts that eventually push you into having conversations with people or having conversation with yourself if you're going to do the podcast by yourself. And I feel like podcasting is only a medium that helps you get those thoughts and get those expressions out. So for the longest time I thought, yeah, like, you have to probably like kickstart, do a podcast, and that's like the ultimate scene. But I guess the podcast part is just medium, but a lot of it involves, how do you see learning around you? Like, is it something that you would just observe from things around you, which is with respect to building products, or with respect to just thinking about ideas? Do you like brainstorming with people? Do you actually enjoy listening to stories? Like, do you like how you and I do now, Rohit? Do you just talk to people, get inspired from the way that they've done things, and you would want people around you to get to hang out with them, sort of like sit down with you and the person that you're talking to, and just have a very visceral form of listening to stories. So I think podcasting as a medium is great in helping people visualize those stories when they just hear conversations, when they just hear two people talking. So I think that part of podcasting really excites me, and that's what makes me probably do that on the Founders Foyer. And I think to start with, how I entered into this space or wanting to host podcasts, I think it goes way back to 2019, when I used to attend women in product meetups in Chennai. And we used to have a lot of people who came in with great questions about how to break into product, how to, transition from one role to another in product. And we always had this buzz conversation going on. And my then friends that I had from the community, two of them, Padmini and Srinidhi, and we were like, okay, you know what? These kind of conversations are interesting. And what would happen if we just take it beyond these meetups? Can we do something about it? And at that point in time, I think podcast was really like a scene in India where you had a lot of them hosting podcasts. And then, this kind of a thing that people used to flaunt. Hey, like I commute to work and I listen to something called podcast. And then you're like, curiously, okay, oh my God, like what is that? Like I want to go check that out. So I think that time we all kind of knew podcasting was simply a way to just record conversations, put it on the cloud, and then just have people listen to it, like another alternate format to YouTube videos. So, we were like, okay, why don't we run a podcast? Like, why don't we talk about some of these questions about breaking into product, or how product experiences of different people would be, by just talking to them and then putting those conversations out in the world. So that's exactly how our audio podcasting started. And I still remember that we used to record conversations on our mobile. Like, we never had like a proper setup, or we never had like a mic, and whatever we talk about today, it just all started with, hey, like, I'll just get this person on the call and let's just do like a record, and like, let's just do that as a podcast. So most often it started off with phone recording, and I think eventually you pick up the nuances of running a podcast. But like I said, getting back to the start, what makes you do those conversations? What makes you share your ideas? I think that part is very, very important for you to stick around, to continue doing the podcast episodes after episodes. And also, as you grow further in this space, your interests might diversify, and you might then want to do another podcast or do another thing around the same concept. So I think a lot of this is exciting, but yeah, it all roots down to how excited are you to learn new things from people around you. So that's how I see it.
Definitely such a great journey, I must say, Aishwarya, because I could relate to each and every word that you said. And we started on to the same year, like 2019 was the year when I started. We didn't have kind of a resources. And people usually get to this point that they start thinking a lot about the resources and the equipments. But it's more about the kind of content, the kind of value that you are going to provide through that particular medium. And what I feel about podcast is it's such a great medium, and it has to be in an unstructured way. You don't have to think a lot about it, like how you have to go ahead, what kind of face you'll be having, do you have to be camera conscious or not. So you don't have to think about all of these questions. It's more about the kind of conversations you are going to have, and those should be unfiltered one. It's just about you and me talking, not thinking about like who is listening to us or how many people are going to watch to us, but it's more about getting immersed into that conversation. That will totally sound like a raw conversation, and that is where most people will relate to us. And this is the kind of essence that we are providing to the listeners, the viewers now. The trends has changed. People are doing it in the video format as well. But the core essence always stays into the audio, and glad that we started onto the same note. And your journey, like being into product and then taking those conversations out with the people, it's something fascinating, because more and more people then be wanting to start their own show if they're into product or into the similar fields. So you are a kind of an inspiration for them. But do you find any surprising overlaps between the way you build successful products and the way you approach your podcast as well? Because there could be some kind of product management hacks. So do you use any of them into your show?
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's a good question, and I think all of us as humans, we kind of draw parallels from things that we are very much used to, or things that really fascinate us. And I think in that sense, I would definitely draw parallels to building products as opposed to building podcasts, because at the end of the day, both of these are nothing but just ideating, getting from the idea stage to kind of nurturing and growing this project all along, and then eventually experimenting, seeing how this sticks with you, sticks with the people around you, the end users who would be trying to use your product, or the end listeners who would be listening to the conversation. So there is a lot of parallel that you can draw to both of these experiences of building products and building podcasts. And at the end of the day, one core thing that unites both is how much of creative energy do you put in to that particular work that you're into. Because whether it is trying to build software products, or whether it is trying to record an episode, like you said, there is a lot of joy that actually happens in the moment. And most often, with respect to products or podcasts, a lot of us just think only about the outcome, or the destination, which is, hey, I want this to be like a great product. I want this to just hit the market. I just want this to have instant product market fit. And likewise with the podcast, where I'm like, oh my God, like I want this episode to go viral. Like, while you're just thinking about getting to record an episode, there are a lot of thoughts that would drive you or pull you towards the outcome, which is great. I think having the outcome somewhere along the horizon is great, and it's one way to help you stay connected and focused and consistent. But I think it should also not pull you down as much, such that you forget to be in the moment, or you forget to get into the kind of flow or the joy that you get in hosting that, or the joy that you get in building something, just trying to solve for the problem. So I think that part is very important. As much as you have one part of your journey rooted to the outcome, the largest part of your journey should still be with respect to focusing on those little things, enjoying the craft, doing it because you enjoy recording the conversation rather than thinking about, oh, this guest is going to be great because they have like an amazing audience. So automatically, I would probably have this episode go viral, or just only thinking about the mechanics and forgetting to actually get more value out of what you record. Or same thing with products, right? Like just forget about the fact that whatever you're building is actually giving like a very thoughtful user experience to your end users, instead of really focusing on that. If you just put your whole focus on getting it on the charts, then I think that alone is not very useful. So that is always my thought with respect to running a podcast, is that as much as getting something to production and to live is important, the same amount of work should go into enjoying the craft. And I think a lot of that shows up as you record. Like Rohit, in your case, like I know you enjoy podcasting a lot and you enjoy connecting with people. So that's exactly what you're doing when you and I talk, and you are like curiously trying to understand why I prefer something, or why I'm inclined to a certain thought. I think that's very important, especially when somebody starts a podcasting journey. It's very important to stay true to that kind of thread of curiosity and trying to really understand what made you enter, or what makes you do this as an episode, rather than just focusing on like, do I have all these things right, or do I just have to stick to these 5 questions and then just forget about how can you actually get a beautiful story out.
And we all are unique human beings. Like if you try to compare, we won't be able to match the kind of efforts that we take. But it's more about the craft, as you said. Like you have to put in the efforts. You need to get that value out of it, and it happens step by step. So with the products, it has been the same case for you. Like you start building that, you get to know like, no, this is not working. You need to change the particular process. You need to adapt to a certain better conditions or whatever stages you have with building the products. Same goes with the podcasting, is what I believe. It's all about the trial and error. You just have to be unique. You just have to be creative as well. And you never know, like, unless and until that particular feedback comes into a picture, when people start sharing that, oh, I love this episode of yours, I'm able to relate to that. Then you start feeling that, no, this is something that I must strive on building. This is where I'll be putting a lot of efforts, and I'll reiterate that particular kind of episodes where people are learning from it.
Yeah, totally. And I think podcast as a medium is very forgiving for the fact that you can experiment and you can try a lot of things. You can see what sticks. And if you really do something and you don't find yourself inclined to it, it's okay to take a step back and try to say, oh, like I did that episode, or I recorded this particular piece of content, and I don't think it's really bringing out the joy in me, or it's really not giving me a sense of exploration. So what do I do about it? So I think that part of just getting yourself recorded, or just sitting down with somebody trying to record an episode and really thinking about it in the hindsight and analyzing it is sort of learning in itself. So it's not just you learn only when you record, but once you do the recording, there's a lot of learning that you can take from what you've just recorded in terms of getting better with each step. So I absolutely agree with you with the fact that there is a lot of trial and error that you can do. And even with respect to, I think, choosing how to record, because off the talk, we were chatting about how, people start recording or start picking up concepts based on what they're really good at. Like somebody who's good with software testing starts to think about, hey, like, can I record something? Can I just get my ideas out in this space that is really interesting me, which I'm really passionate about? I think that's, at the end of the day, that is podcasting, right? You have a lot of ideas in your head, and sometimes you just want to get those creatively out. And writing is one format to it, and I think speaking is another format, and podcast comes very close to the speaking format, where you either try to record it by yourself, or in other cases, you have like an interview style, like how we're doing, where you just pull in your buddy or somebody that can really contribute to this as much as you have a passion for. Then just sit down with them and try to get very different perspectives from them by just bouncing off questions, and then trying to share your perspectives, and also like trying to listen to what they have got to say around the same thing. So I think at the end of the day, it is getting your ideas out, and ideas can just have different formats, and podcast as such just helps people explore those formats, whether it is a certain style or a certain format of questions that you ask, or a certain way to record an episode. Some people do this kind of a change with the timing format, where they record shorter clips or shorter episodes, and some people go on to like full length ones, like 3 hours, 2 hours. And I think those are like really great ways for you to go ahead and experiment to see what is really making you enjoy this podcasting journey. So in that sense, I always feel that podcast is very forgiving as a medium, because it helps you explore those different pathways that you've got before you just stick on to one thing and say, hey, I'm just going to like start doing this.
That's so true. And we just don't have to stick to one pattern that I'll be just doing the interview kind of show or the monologue. There are different formats that you can try it out. You'll be surely having success with that, because whatever you try to do with your show, it is your own show. That is first thing that you have to remember. You can try to do anything with that. However bad it sounds or the way you are not feeling comfortable, it's just about the adaptability. The more you do, the better you get it at it. So that's the kind of a process that we need to follow. And we'll be coming to the format thing on a later part as well. But I would love to know from you, Aishwarya, what's the best part of the podcast that you love? Like, what's your favorite part of it? Because then continuing on this journey is a kind of a difficult task. People have started podcasting. They say that it is a lot of efforts, may not yield best of results with respect to the revenue or so. That may happen with a lot of them. But is it something that drives you? Is the conversation or the feedback or something else entirely?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Rohit. I think the best part for me to just keep coming back to podcasting or just keep doing and getting going at it is the kind of rabbit hole that it pushes me into. Because I am generally, a curious person. I just love interacting with people. And this is even off grid, like off topic to podcasting. When I meet somebody in person, I just love conversing with them, trying to understand the way that they think. So I think ever since I was a kid, I just loved to get through to understand how do people think, like what is running in their mind. And if there is something that I'm thinking about and I'm immediately curious about, oh well, I'm thinking it this way, but is there like another pattern, is there like something else that somebody else could think about, or are they thinking the same things as me? So all of these kind of questions and interrogatives just keep you always curious about what's just happening around you. And to a certain extent, that pushed me into just observing things around me, which is another totally different trait that you pick up, and it could help with podcasting and a lot of other things as well.
Same with me.
Yeah, right. So I think being a good observer overall has definitely helped me take notice of little things and like just pay attention to those craft and those things that which people otherwise would not really focus on. So probably some of those quirks have always been there. But the largest part, like I said, the rabbit hole part was always about how do I get to know the different meanings or different aspects around something that I'm thinking. So if there is like a singular way to think, what are the other fringes that that particular concept could have? What are the other formats, or what are the other patterns to how a certain thing is perceived? So that has always been a thing of curiosity for me. And for the longest time, I think reading books or reading articles or whatever it is was definitely like a satiating thing for me to get to that answer, right? Like, oh, like people have very different perspectives, and look, that's how they've written so many amazing books or so many amazing articles that they have discovered about. But when it came to podcasts, I think I was really happy I was able to discover the fact that the same kind of an answer that I was always seeking for, which is to see how people think, like what are the different ways they think, or like why is somebody even sharing this perspective, came through great stories and great conversations. So I think that aspect of running a podcast is really bringing me that energy. And I believe that you can only have so much fun running a podcast if you're also able to get that vibe in, right? You're also able to reflect that energy. And as a host, a lot of the podcast is a telling thing based on the energy that you bring to the guest, and which they can like just vibe along with you and share. So I think what you enjoy and take away from the show is something that you eventually end up putting a lot more on as you record the episode. So that part about exploration and trying to just get my kind of high with conversations is what drives me to probably do. And with Founders Foyer as well, right? Like I love the fact that anywhere across the world, I can just pull in somebody, just sit down with them and like kind of like understand the way they think and the way they, enjoy certain things, share their thoughts. And this is just so unapologetically like trying to just dig into their quirks, try to understand their interests, and also like kind of share your ideas and blend all of this together. I think that part is super exciting for me. And anytime that I have to do it from scratch, I would always like close my eyes and do. So yeah, that's the best part of doing a podcast for me. I think there's always this kind of a thing inside you, right? Like you're always bundling up with questions and like, I just want to get this out of my head. So I think if you are that kind of a person who just has like constant things running in your mind and you're like, oh my God, I have this idea and I just don't know who to talk with. Don't worry, you have a podcast guest, just pull them in, talk all of this, and then get it out of your head. So in a lighter tone, I think just getting your ideas out is as with podcast as a medium is great. I think it kind of helps you also see, like I said, the observational aspects, right? Like let's say when you start to do a podcast, when you start to set up a podcast of your own, the podcast just is a medium, like I said. So a lot of this is around conversation. So the rabbit hole that I was telling you about is to start digging into the guest and the kind of background that they have, the kind of, things that they're interested about. And sometimes that starts to blend in with things you observe about yourself, things that you probably read 2-3 days ago in a certain article, or things that you just probably spoke to another guest a while ago, like a few weeks ago. All of this start to come in together, that when you have these conversations, you're very, very present in the moment. And I've always found myself having this sort of synonymity whenever I do the podcast. It's probably not about, okay, like question one, and here you go, answer one, and then question two and answer two. It's never like that. I think when you just start the conversation, something that they say kind of rings a bell, and you're like, oh my God, like I think the other guest was talking about a similar thing, and you go on to share an anecdote from there. And then when you start the conversation, there's also like, oh, I think I just read a similar note of a while ago, and then you start talking about that story. So I think one thing builds on to the other, and by the end of the conversation, you just have like a great kind of a story built around with what you had in your mind, and also what you were able to take away from somebody who's just sitting with you, willing to listen to you and willing to share their thoughts and ideas as well. So I think that part about doing a podcast is something that I believe is sort of where the magic lies.
I want to know from you, Aishwarya, like what's the kind of a process that you follow for each episode? Like how do you prepare for it? Is it a kind of a strict outline? I don't think so that it is the case, but like, is it the organic flow of conversation that you embrace? And it's always about like when you are talking on your podcast, it's more with the founders who are into that particular domain. So how do you ensure that your guests offer the kind of a practical tips and the value that listeners are looking forward to?
Right. So yeah, before I just move on to share my experience, I completely second with what you said about people wanting to start podcasts but then not really like submitting themselves for the long game, right? And for me, I always think is the long game part that works out for a podcast, because a lot of it is based on what we call as consistency. Like you have to be consistent at this game. You just have to commit yourself to again, it's not about following a content schedule, or it's not about just getting stricter with the kind of, oh, like I have to post it today because it's a Wednesday. It's not like that. But I think just sort of having an accountability to what you've signed yourself up for is very important. I think with respect to podcasts, that kind of shows in the way people would also eventually build trust in you. Because let me just put out the fact that it's not very easy, right? It's, let's say you record 3 conversations and let's say you just put it out, but you kind of have very trickling listeners and you kind of don't see that many subscribers go up. It's very easy to just kind of give up and then try to say, okay, there's nobody listening to it, so I don't think my podcast is going to add any value, or my podcast is just going to be yet another podcast out there. So it's kind of easier to think that from that sense and give up. But to me, the way I see is, you have to figure out what really drives you and what really ticks you in the podcast game. And it's absolutely okay if it's going to be subscribers or the kind of growth that you're too inclined about. I think it also gives you an answer about why not to continue a podcast. Because sometimes I feel that you shouldn't push yourself to something if that's not organically giving you joy, or it's not like trying to give you the sense of satisfaction with what you do. And the reason I say this is because sometimes podcast is not the answer to all of the questions that you've got. Maybe you do have another kind of a channel or another kind of a medium that could help you bring out your ideas or build that experience that you would want. But it's just that if podcasting is the answer and if you really enjoy doing it, then committing to it in the long game is very essential. So it's okay if that's not your cup of coffee or tea, but that's also like a very good answer for you to figure out based on how much of joy it gives you and how much are you able to stay consistent to it. So that consistent game is something that I've seen, not just with respect to some of the amazing content people that I've seen in the space, but in general, I think it's a sort of it's a very minute difference between what eventually pulls you and what you have to build as a cold discipline. The cold discipline would not work out for the longest time, because I think you would then do it not from the place of joy, but more from the place of, okay, I have to do this because, I have to do this. But why? Like, there is no answer. The answer to I have to do this is because I have to do this. It's not about the fact that it gives you, a sense of satisfaction, or it makes you do it because it really gives you that kind of a happiness. So yeah, with that said, I think moving into the format that I follow. So like I was telling you before, I started off with an audio podcast way back in 2019 and it continued with that. So there was a time that I was really like, I didn't enjoy audio podcasts, but I also thought that there was that kind of a magic that I always saw when I looked at video episodes. Like I also used to consume a lot of, and which I still do, consume a lot of video content or, podcast content. And I realized that there was this one thing that I was really not doing, which was video. And for the longest time, I think I thought setting up a video podcast or recording a video always came with a lot of work or a lot of mechanics that people often tell about. They're like, oh, do you have like a DSLR camera with you? Do you have that? Do you have this? There was always like an array of questions that you had to answer before you went on to record an episode. So when in the early 2022, I was just giving myself like a task that, okay, let's just see how this goes. Like even before doing podcasting and all that, I had this idea that I wanted to do something in the building space, like something called the Founders Foyer. I think before even I realized that the Founders Foyer is going to be a podcast, the name stuck with me. So the name is what started out even before the podcast was born. So I just one day opened up my notes app and I was typing that, oh, like what would it be to have like a hallway kind of conversation that you sit down with builders, have conversations with them, and maybe sort of learn something. So let's probably keep this as a weekly activity this year, where every week or every 2 weeks, I reach out to somebody, learn something from them, just cold DM them. And then I was like, okay, wait, I really like podcasting. And some of these conversations can actually be public because it's that I learn something at the same time I'm able to contribute it to others. And when you think about, for the longest time, when you think about podcasts, I think there was, especially in the building space, there was always podcasts around product, breaking into product management, everything around product. And the other extreme, which is about building things, scaling up things, running companies, running orgs, and all of those, like Masters of Scale and all of those other similar league ones. But in the middle ground, there was a gray area where I felt like, hey, like I am building out something 0 to 1, like very, very scratch kind of a thing. I have an idea. Like, let's say I just want to start a newsletter or I want to build a very, very small product. I just have an idea. How do I go about? Like, I have very, very silly questions. Like, who do I just look up to? And how do I find out other people? And that was one main thing that I felt that gray area needs to have content. And why can't it be me to just bring out those different creators and builders and founders? So that was definitely one aspect that pushed me into. Yeah, I think the other aspect to me was when it came to product building, people obviously think about how do I, put this out to a market? How do I find product market fit? How do I test out these assumptions? How do I build an MVP? A lot of these traditional mindset to product building. But let's say you meet a neuroscientist. What can you learn from them that can be applied back to product building? Let's say you talk to a stand-up comedian. Was that related to product? So a lot of these parallel domains where you can talk to people who've actually been in tech, people who've worn multiple hats, and then get to listen to their experiences, get to listen to their stories and bring that back into tech is something that I was really passionate about. And I thought for building something, for actually creating from an idea to shipping something out to the market, you definitely need that kind of inspiration that could come from different areas. And I felt like hey, why should I stick to a certain niche to be able to build products? Why can't versatility in tech be my niche? So that's exactly what pushed me into choosing a format for the Founders Foyer, which is to bring in the best thinkers who love building out ideas, who love creating something because of the passion for it, because they enjoy the craft. And I started finding people who particularly matched, this kind of an audience, who particularly could give very, very, very different thoughts of learning. So that's one different thing that I did for the podcast. I think the other thing was, of course, when I started out with the audio podcast, I knew cold messaging was the way to building out the guest list. But when I was doing this podcast, I wanted to do something different. Like you said, the candid part, I wanted to bring in people who were extremely vulnerable, who actually loved talking something very raw and not really polishing up whatever they wanted to share. So that was definitely the criteria. And the second thing was, before I reached out to somebody, I really tried to spend more time with the way they think, which is at least with respect to a lot of what I found as their assets on social media. So let's say I'm going to interview a guest. I would ensure that I am consuming their thoughts, I'm consuming what they're putting out on the internet as much as possible for at least a brief period of a couple of weeks. So once I start to understand the kind of things that they care about, the kind of topics that they're interested about and they talk about, that gives me a lens of how do I approach, like how do I set the tone for the conversation. So I just don't want to like bombard them with questions because I enjoy these questions and they don't actually have an answer to the questions. So I think that kind of an approach really worked out because it helped me figure out the things that were just particularly tailored for them was one. The other thing being they were excited for the fact that those questions were probably not brought up with them in other podcasts or in other formats. So they always found it very strange that, oh, like, how do you really know that this was something that was, very, very particular to me? So that kind of an attention to getting my guest stories right. I know it's a lot of rabbit hole work that you have to do before a conversation, but I think I really enjoyed that. I really started getting more involved, not just on the day of the conversation, but doing a lot of research. So I always believe in the fact that 80% of the podcast is how you try to get the stories to present, and the 20% is the remaining recording. But the 80% is to get your guest to that range of being their own self, being their own, in their own mind space and sharing what they're generally very curious about. So that is the other format that I tried for my podcast, is that I spend days and weeks exposing myself to the content or the thoughts that people, my guests particularly, put out, and then reach out. So, and the third last thing that works out, or rather worked out and still continues to work out for me, is sometimes you don't have to approach everything very transactionally, right? Like, let's say you actually want to record somebody, but you don't have the intent of it. Just connecting with people for the sake of it, like just doing some goodwill, just trying to talk to people from the idea of being very curious about what they do sometimes could lead to very unusual paths, because people that have just probably like cold message by just saying like, hey, you do some good work, I really enjoy your stuff that you put out, has actually helped me connect better with them, and then helped me realize that, hey, like your story is great, and like just talking to you has probably opened up doors for me to bring you onto the podcast. And sometimes you don't always have to message people or bring in people just with the sole intent of bringing them on the podcast. So you might never know where your guests or where your conversations could come from. So just leaving that 20-30% of room to be out there supporting, championing other creators, enjoying people's work, just letting people know about it, I don't know, can do some good back to you, or sometimes just can help you feel positive. So that's the other thing that's worked out for me.
That's the work you have to do. That's the real work. And love your approach, because studying people out there for weeks and still managing to release the episodes on your schedule is something that people fail to do usually. But it's more about like how deep you go into that particular person, get known to them within your mind, and then try to bring out something that will relate to the audience. So ultimately we feel that it's just about we two, and there are people who are going to listen to us. So in what way we are building that particular conversation is something that will again depend on the kind of research you have done, the kind of format you have choose. About format, like there are multiple formats that people can choose, and the podcasting is all open to it. And we have seen like people have been doing monologue, people have been doing co-hosting format, the guest interviews, the debates and all. It's all happening into the podcasting space. So this is such an unique medium. We have seen creators now being jumping into the podcasting arena. That is where the whole kind of a spotlight is happening, and that is the word podcasting. That is the buzz it has created, and it's more about the raw and real conversation that happens through this kind of a medium, so people are able to relate to the thoughts. And I want to know from you, Aishwarya, with respect to, you have talked about the process about how do you get that particular information or the value that you are looking forward to get from a guest, but then what's the way of finding those guests? How do you decide about, no, I want this particular person to be on my show, and then I'll start researching about it?
So this is where I think having a sense of how do you want your podcast to look like, or what does it really solve for, like the kind of core purpose that you get back to is very important, because this decides the people that you would appreciate being on the podcast, or you think your listeners would also eventually enjoy, because you kind of have a synonymous approach, not just with your own thoughts, but with also the kind of kinship that you have with respect to listening. So it all starts there at, like, how do you want to craft the purpose of why you're doing this particular podcast? So to me, I think it came down to, like I said, I found that there are so many creators and product builders out there, but the kind of knowledge that they often end up listening to or just being around is always around traditional content. But how do you, and like every second person you meet in the product space is going to talk to you about, find your niche, like try to just double down on one particular thing, and then try to, as much as possible, get your knowledge built out of it. But I think I wanted to somewhere break that. Like I just felt that a lot of your thinking could expand, a lot of your curiosity could expand if you're able to just have that breadth of knowledge shared. And what's the best way to do that is to find people who are probably in that intersection, right? Like people who actually know what they're talking in the tech space, or in building stuff out, whether it is a newsletter, whether it is a product, or whether it is a, an idea built out into an app, whatever it is. I think people who are great at shipping things, like who actually have been in that arena building, doing things at the same time, who've also shared a very, very unique personality. I think it's very important that you let the podcast reflect that personality, because that's how you're able to bring those unique stories, right? I mean, when you keep asking the same questions and kind of like, you're psychologically driving them to give you the same answers. But the minute that you naturally tend to hunt down on people who bring that different voice, or who have that capacity to share something very, very different from you, from the listeners, and from the rest of them who've earlier been on your podcast, then it's also very important that you kind of drive them through the questions that are very tailored at them. So in that sense, I always tend to, find people out on social platforms like LinkedIn or Twitter, people that I think who have that, who carry that intersection really well, like people who can talk about tech, who actually have this kind of strong knowledge in tech, at the same time people who are either, let's say, who've built out a career very, very uniquely in media space, or probably in psychology, or probably, in neuroscience, or in particularly like an arts background. So all of this at the end of the day would just help you think about the same things but with different lenses. So that's how I think I go on to pick people to talk on my podcast. And I think I'm very clear with the purpose. The one core thing that I would want to focus on for Founders Foyer is to have a very clear form of thinking. Like, how can you get your thinking better? Because I think once you get your thinking better, once you broaden the way you think, it all falls into place with respect to building out your ideas, or with respect to eliminating your biases, and then trying to just get into the flow of what you want to do. So with that in mind, I think I want this to be like a space that creators and builders can look up to get better at their thinking. And that can come from a variety of spaces, like I said. So that's how I tend to reach out to my podcast guests, people who believe in a very similar notion, and people who've always done work that could reflect and talk about this kind of an intersection and dimension.
Definitely. And that clarity comes as in when we start spending more time on it. But I would love to tell that now we are in 2023. By 2024, things will be changing a lot in a very different way. The way we started in 2009 is totally different than what we are seeing. So better study the kind of a format that you want to carry with your show, and do the study as and when you are required to do, because you can't just go and like, let's see that we'll recording 3-4 episodes and how it goes, and then we'll try to do more of it. No, that's not the approach that you should be following. you can like get rolling your show out there for the audience, but need to have that kind of a clear why into your mind, that why you are doing it. So if the purpose is clear, then it will be yielding better results, because ultimately there are numbers, there are analytics that you will be tracking. So that shouldn't be demotivating to you. But it's like, if you're loving the conversations that you are having onto the show, you won't be caring much about them. But it's necessary that where you are heading, what different you have to do, what kind of geography is the target audience that you are looking forward to target, that will all be showing up into the analytics. So you have to take care of both the elements. You do start preparing for your own show as well, and see how it goes with the analytics as well. And on the other side, you can be raw and organic without caring about what kind of numbers you are getting. But as you said, you have to be unique, and you are unique in itself, that you also are a product manager, then you are hosting a podcast show as well, you are into drawing and painting, poetry and all. So does that really make you a better podcast host by doing all of this, or it is a totally different feeling and the approach that you follow?
Yeah, I mean, in some sense, I think these are all different parts of you, right? And to me, I always look up to it as how it defines your personality. Like, I just when I'm, I always tend to say this to a lot of my fellow circles and friends, that I just love daydreaming. Like, I just love the fact that you can think about random ideas, think about random things that you're really drawn towards, and some of those can actually manifest, and some of those can actually help you realize what is actually making you find interest and drawing your parallels. So to answer your question in a direct sense, yes, I think a lot of these are like finding different identities within you, like parts of you that enjoy talking to people, parts of you that enjoy probably like writing things down, probably building stuff, or let's say you really love outdoors, or you just love a particular sport. So to me, all of that comes together as different personalities, and together defines you as an individual. And why not? Like, I mean, I've always found that if you try to embrace those different personalities that you have, it kind of shows up in the energy that you bring through with your guests. And when you start the conversation, let's say at the start of this podcast, we were talking about how people can actually start at where they are. Like, if they're really curious about, automation testing, if they're really curious about a particular sport like tennis, whatever it is, I think conversations around that could start as a podcast. So a lot of the other parallel interests that a person could have can have a very indirect approach, or can have a very indirect influence on the way that they carry themselves, or the kind of purpose that they would want to have for the podcast, or even the kind of guests that they connect with. So I think that kind of a whole self thing is eventually how you explore different versions of yourself and get that out to blend into the podcast. So yeah, I think to me, I always feel that all of these come together if I set out to do something of my own, like recording an episode, or trying to paint, or trying to write something. So that's also to answer the part that you were talking about, how people should stay focused to the purpose, right? Because having a sense of clarity of why do you want to do that, like having a sense of the purpose, is also going to help you attach yourself to the long game. Because the metrics or the outcome is very important. That's like one large part of the step. But the other larger part is definitely trying to see what is driving you towards something such as a podcast, or an episode, and what are the other things that you could bring on to have that unique voice, or a something that is so individual about you. So yeah.
Wonderful, Aishwarya. It's such a task to do all of it and then still not be tired of doing it. That's the kind of interest that we need, and every
Yeah.
podcaster must be prepared for this kind of a journey. So you need to enjoy that part. And I'm loving your insights, the kind of conversation we are having. It is bringing me to the conclusion that we are able to do a lot of things, and you have to have that kind of a purpose. You need to have that kind of a direction to your way of thinking, so that you can accomplish your goals with respect to the podcasting as well. And we have seen that now with respect to the podcasting as well, we are able to build the community between our own core circle as well. It's not just about the podcasters, but into the tech field, or be it the marketing and any of the field they may take, wherever your niche lies. So have you seen any kind of amazing collaborations that are happening, or the ventures emerging from the founders Foyer community also? Were there any kind of opportunities that were created, or anything that sort of?
Absolutely. I think with respect to some of these things that you do, especially with the podcast, right? There are like newer doors that it could open yourself up to, and sometimes you just sign yourself for newer challenges. And by newer challenges, I mean even figuring out newer guests, people that you once thought are probably just far to reach and so difficult to bring through, have been in the conversation. And I'm like, oh my god, like these are people that I thought one day, probably like years from now, I would talk to them. But these people are just so happy and just so humble to be on your podcast, and they're like, hey, like sign me up, like why wouldn't I want to be, kind of a thing. So just hearing that out from them is even like a very happier thing for you, because these are people that you look up to and you really thought would be hard to get them on the show. So that kind of a satisfaction is something that I got when I got to host some of my favorites from the product and the creator space on the Founders Foyer. And even the kind of sponsorships to podcasts, right? So that was the first time of really working on with tools and like trying to have sponsors for the show for the very first time. And that was a great learning. And I think I'm very excited to see how that goes forward in 2024 as well. But it was a great start for me this year. And that gave me like a very different horizon to think about. So a lot of sponsorship is how people take bet on you, have the kind of trust in you, and also the trust in what you're building with the podcast. So I think people have this question about what is the right number of episodes to host before I have my first sponsor, or what is the
Zero.
Yeah, correct. So what is the topmost number of audience I can report, or what is the maximum number of episodes that I can record in a certain season? We always have questions. I think it's amazing to have questions. It's great as a podcaster. In fact, it's only questionable if you don't have a question. But the important part is, do you have the right questions? Like, are you panicking about the right things, right? Because sometimes you just keep questioning yourself about the wrong things, the things that wouldn't need focus. Like, is this a good quality mic? Is this like a good camera? Am I like on the right makeup? Am I like doing this right? Am I like blah blah blah? Like just worrying about things that probably are away from the content that actually has the core value. Anything away from that is just going to take your focus onto things that wouldn't matter at all. So you would be able to, I think, serendipitously see opportunities around you only when you're able to focus on the content and its value, and also the people that you interact with. And sometimes things don't have to be as tangible and as monetary as like sponsorships, but it could be very, very genuine friendships that you can build out of a podcast. It could be, the network that you build. Like, I could probably, like, somebody listening to Rohit's episode with me could actually reach out to me and say, hey, I'm Rohit's friend. And it's like, I made a friend. So I think such radical encounters are very important in the podcasting space, because those are things that actually add up to the positive value of why you're doing this in the first place. Yes, of course, you're launching an episode and you're actually putting something out in the market. You're shipping something, that's great. But I think beyond that, the kind of non-transactional zeros, the kind of infinite sum game, I would say, not the zero sum, but the kind of infinite sum game that you play to have that goodwill that you're building, I think that part is very important. And I'm so lucky that Founders Foyer has given me so much of that over the last a year and so that I've been running this. So that is the best part for me to run the podcast, and to also look forward to keep running the podcast.
Amazing, Aishwarya. And you like, it will instill the belief that it is possible, because many of them fear that the revenue through podcasting won't be coming very soon. But if you are working into the right direction, I feel that nothing is impossible into that particular direction.
It starts small, but like you said, it definitely pushes you forward. It helps you, learn a lot of new things in the way.
And at times it could be just about the barter. Like, you shouldn't be expecting a lot of things. If you're giving something, ask them in return that, hey, how you can help me out. Like, I'll be helping you out with the kind of a slot with respect to your startup or the marketing that you wanted to do. So it reaches to the more people. So they'll be sharing your podcast episodes into their own content or so. So this is the way we have to work onto the kind of sponsorships or the projects that you can work together, and it will be a great journey. Now, coming on to the last part of this episode, Aishwarya, whatever we do comes and boils down to the numbers. So it's more about the downloads and the analytics, whatever it shows to us. But it's more important to gauge the kind of impact that a podcast is creating. So for you, what it is about? Like, is it about the stories that you hear from your listeners, or the DMs you get, the emails you may be getting, the feedback kind of a thing? Or is it just about the numbers for you as well?
The things that are very tangibly seen, the numbers. So definitely when people start podcasts, they often tell you about like, hey, it's great to see how a certain episode topped the chart or a certain episode went viral because so many people shared it. Yes, numbers are great, but the way I see numbers is slightly different. I think I don't focus, or I'm not very fixated about what is the immediate viewer count or the number count that this particular episode is going to hit for me, because kind of a couple of years from now or a decade from now, if people are searching for something and the founders for your conversation is going to come up, I think I find that as the true value of content for me. Like I said, the podcasting is a long game for me. So it's not about the fact that, yeah, it is great. Like, of course, when people share my episode and kind of like talk about, show great numbers, it's amazing to see that kind of a growth that your podcast can have. But that is, I've at least personally kept that secondary. I kind of like clap pat at myself and say, hey, like this is great numbers. But there's one singular thing that I put as on the pedestal, and say that's the most important part for me is somebody listening to this either now or a decade from now or a couple of years from now, are they able to find something that they really came for? And that has proved, when people see me in person, that's the first thing that they start like, hey, I heard this conversation the other day and that conversation was fantastic. Like, I didn't know this person actually had like another side of a story to them. Or it's about the fact that, this piece made me reflect on a lot of things, and I actually looked at a certain thing in a very different angle because I heard you talk to this person. So a lot of those messages that they share with me, either through virtual or in IRL when I kind of meet them in person, that is taking enough belief for me. Like, being able to build that belief and trust capital with my podcast is the prime part for me. And the icing on the cake for me was, at the end of the conversation, I leave the guest more energized than how they entered the podcast. It's like they don't get tired, right? Like, they're like, oh, like, is that all? Like, there's more to it. So they just leave with as much excitement as and the energy that they had as they came in. And the best part was, they ask you like, hey, like, I just did like so many episodes so far, but none of these questions probably were as thoughtful as probably what you brought to me today. So that kind of instilled the thing in me that, okay, a lot of that groundwork that I do to get them share the right stories have, particularly helped me. So I think I measure the success through that. And definitely metrics are great. Like, it's great to, when Spotify Wrapped released the metrics, it was great to see how many new countries I had listeners from. That was great to see that. But at the same time, I would still put what I told as the belief capital part, as the prime central thing on the pedestal for me.
And you were right, Aishwarya. You were talking about the kind of content that you have been creating with your show and the impact it creates. It's more about like how relevant the kind of episode that you created will stay relevant in near future as well. So to tell a story about it, like I did a episode about the menstruation long back, and this time recently Smriti Irani made a statement about like menstruation period leaves thing, and internet got crazy about posting about how this thing should be taken, and then reshared this particular episode again, and I got few new listeners as well, and they did applaud me, like they did applaud me that glad that you took this up for the conversation. So this is the kind of impact that you can create with your podcast, and the kind of content that you create will always stay relevant if it holds the right value at the right period of time. And we all are evolving. It's not that we'll be having a common phenomenon for over the period of time. It's more about how you embrace that particular change, what different you are doing, and in what way you'll be getting new success with your own show. So it's more about the trial and error that you have to take care of it, and the show must go on is what I can say at last. And at least people should always remember that it's more about the efforts that you take, and stick to this. It's a long term game. You should be able to cherish those moments. Whatever you have created will not go for waste. It's more about the time that you have invested into the conversation. Somewhere down the line, one person will be able to relate to it, and that is what all we need. That one person, and his or her life changing from that particular moment or the conversation. So that's the kind of impact we almost try to achieve. And your journey has been so inspiring. The conversation that we had is totally an eye opener for me as well, and everyone who will be tuning into this episode, because it gives you the hope, it gives you a kind of belief in yourself as well, that no, this is possible. Even though I'm doing a lot of things at one time, it's still possible to do a podcast or create content, and that is what you have been doing so well. So I really appreciate your journey into this. So thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to record an episode for this podcast show, that is Indian Podcasting Revolution. And I wish you all the best for your future endeavors.
Thank you so much, Rohit. It was fantastic sitting down with you and trying to chat about what both of us truly believe in, right? Which is to just share our ideas and run our own podcast for the joy that it gives, like we always spoke about. So I think your questions were very, very parallel to what we both believed in, and it was easy for me to also share my thoughts in that context. So thank you so much for having me and giving me those wonderful moments in sharing my journey of the Founders Foyer with the listeners.
Definitely keep creating and let that voice amplify the impact that you are striving to create with the voice.
Yes, and all the best to all the listeners who are in the embarking their journey to get through with the podcast. I think the best journey is always when you begin and then have a lot of other things as you discover new learnings. So I hope the next year is definitely a great start for most of them who are just thinking about to kickstart their podcast. So wishing them all a very great journey ahead. And yeah, once again, thanks, Rohit.
Yep, we all got this. Thank you so much. Bye-bye. Take care. We hope you have liked the podcast episode we have had today on PodPeeps. By the way, if you want to join Podcasters community, fill the form from link in the show notes. And yes, thank you so much for being here today. Do send us a DM on Instagram at DFY Podcast if you follow Indian Podcasting Revolution. And if you are yet to follow, what are you waiting for? Follow it now and join us next week for yet another episode. This is your host Rohit, signing off.